Ukrainians in the last several days managed to liberate at least two villages in Zaporizhia, Mali Sherbaki and Sherbaki, and they supposedly also liberated part of Stepova. However, that's not yet confirmed. But it continues to be a dynamic fight, and a lot of the same trends continue. But the next it's the business is getting very interesting.
Hello and welcome to Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. Now, today on day, I think it's 1,330 of Vladimir Putin's 10-day special military operation or full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we're privileged to be talking to George Barras. Now, George is the Russia team and geospatial intelligence team lead, that's GeoInt team lead, on the Russia and Ukraine portfolio at the Institute for the Study of War. George, welcome back to Frontline.
Thank you so much to have me again, Philip. It's great to be here as always.
Now, as we were saying before we started recording, there's not much going on at the minute, is there? No. Yeah, ISW has been producing some fantastic reports about what's been going on the front lines at the tactical level over the last sort of 72 hours at least. There seems to have been an awful lot of Russia taking a bit of this, Ukraine taking a bit of that, as we've seen beforehand, but more activity than we've seen as normal. What is it that you're seeing?
Well, we got some really interesting tactical vignettes in the front line for the past couple of days. Notably in Donetsk, the Russians have been intensifying some of their mechanized assaults. And this is interesting, right? Because oftentimes you sort of hear these, I think, oversimplified explanations that sort of characterize the war. People will say things like, well, tanks aren't being used anymore, or the tank's not really an effective weapon anymore. And that's like kind of true. But then you get these edge cases where actually tanks still show that they're relevant. So, for example, the Russians the other day conducted a roughly battalion-sized or reinforced battalion-sized mechanized attack with 6 tanks and 30 plus armored personnel carriers. And that was really interesting. I'm not sure how effective it was because many of those vehicles got destroyed. But what was interesting about this particular attack is that the Russians actually leveraged poor weather conditions. We're getting some of the fall rains in Ukraine now, windy conditions. And this is interesting because you can't fly these cheap, quadcopter drones with exposed wiring and stuff in rainy and windy conditions. And so I think there's a lot of truth in saying that conventional, mechanized tactics with tanks and stuff are rendered ineffective in the face of drone defenses. I think that argument has a lot of validity, actually. However, the use of drone tactics are themselves dependent on the proper tactical conditions, and they're not agnostic to things like weather. And so actually, we have these very interesting examples where tanks can be used and are continue to be used when we get these interesting weather conditions. So that's been interesting. And of course, we've not seen a battalion-sized mechanized attack in a couple months. So these things happen on a fairly infrequent and rare basis, but their persistence indicates that, the drone defenses are not by any sort of means a catch-all defense. In terms of the tactical land game, I mean, the Russians are making some interesting gains in Donetsk. They've been able to make some more, they're seizing some more villages or seizing some more towns. It continues to be tactical or sub-tactical level advances. What I want to say here is that all the maps that you're looking at in Ukraine basically are not accurate to a certain extent, in that it is a pointillist front line. There really isn't a continuous forward line of own troops. What we're seeing now is this interspersed series of strong points where you have maybe a couple Ukrainians in a dugout or in a bunker or just in a strong point in a tree line. And then maybe a couple 100 meters away, you will have a Russian position behind that Ukrainian position because some Russians infiltrated in and bunkered down in their own strong point. And then interspersed another 200 meters away, you'll have another Ukrainian position. And this is, and everyone who's making maps of this, they're doing their best to try to show the continuous front lines. But when you get to the places where the Russians have leaned aggressively into these infiltration tactics like Dobropillia, it's a very, very complex tactical situation where you essentially have pockets and islands of Russian-held positions and Ukrainian-held positions that change hands relatively quickly. And the funny thing is that you actually don't need to have a continuous ground line of communication to logistically support those forward elements, because the belligerents are using drones for their logistics. They will use a drone and fly a soldier in a dugout, a pack of cigarettes and a water bottle, um, and that'll sustain them for quite a while, actually. So the front line is very complex in that area. Some good news at the southern Ukraine, the sub-tactical level. In Zaporizhia, the Ukrainians in the last several days managed to liberate at least two villages in Zaporizhia, Mali, Sherbaki, and they supposedly also liberated part of Stepova. However, that's not yet confirmed. But it continues to be a dynamic fight, and a lot of the same trends continue. But the next it's the business is getting very interesting.
Hmm. Well, if a packet of cigarettes and a bottle of water is sustaining someone for a long time, they're not heavy smokers then. But there's so much that you've put into that. So I hope we can start to unpack it a little bit. The fact that the Russians are putting together armored formations and six tanks and a number of armored fighting vehicles supporting it. You know, Clearly controlled at a battalion level. It takes a lot of effort and training to get that ready. Are we seeing the Russians moving new formations down in? Are we seeing them training these formations anywhere? Because with the casualty rates that they're suffering, to get the experience that you need to be able to hope that you can execute this in a way. Clearly, the Russians are not executing it in a good way, but to hope that takes a degree of effort and preparedness beforehand. Is there evidence that they are preparing these packets of armored capability to try and punch through as part of a counteroffensive package?
From the open source, I've not seen any evidence, but I'm not going to make the argument that there isn't any evidence. I think probably just so tactical and so granular that in order to see it, you have to physically be there and understand it. The there's a Russian military blogger. His name is Two Majors, Dva Mayora in Russian, and he recently actually put forward a short essay that was interesting, where he's thinking at the tactical level about how to be able to reintroduce maneuver to mechanized maneuver to warfare. And he postulates that if you have a tank battalion and each of the battalions are individually equipped with high quality electronic warfare systems, and if you surge the battalion at a certain place and time with such and such spacing between the tanks, even if you have really prevalent drones, the Ukrainians have a organic drone sortie rate, so they're not going to be able to destroy all the tanks at once. And so you could basically sacrifice, elements of a battalion to be able to have the momentum to break through. That's interesting. And what I'll say is this: look, in World War One, on the Western Front and the Somme and stuff, the generals didn't spend months and years doing the same suicidal frontal assaults. There were actually tactical innovations and different ideas that were experimented and implemented with each and every one of those attacks. It just so happened to seem like to the soldiers that died that unfortunately most of those tactics didn't work until they did. And so when I see the Russians conduct these suicidal mechanized assaults, which most of which appear to end in tactical failure, with many of the vehicles destroyed, um, I think it's a lazy explanation to simply say, well, the Russians aren't, they're probably just doing the same thing over and over again, and this is like the definition of insanity. I don't think so, actually. I think that the fact is that they have waited for the weather conditions to change, so they did actually refrain from conducting these attacks until it was windy and rainy and the drones were not as effective. And so there are these little breadcrumbs of indications of human innovation, and I have to think that they are innovating. I want to be very clear: the predominant tactic remains and continues to be dismounted infantry, small groups, and efficient tactics. It's just when we see this battalion-sized attack, which is really like a once a month, once every 2 months occurrence, that it sort of makes big waves for those reasons.
Hmm. But again, it shows that if you're putting a mechanized formation together or an armored formation together to put it into an attack, the necessity for there to be a counter drone capability within that, and you've explained quite clearly how the Russians have looked at weather that's in there. We know the Russians have developed an awful lot of electronic warfare capability that they're very reliant on. But we also know that with the level of corruption that there is across the Russian defense industry, some of the electronics that have been put out there look good, they're spread in nice green colors and look very sexy indeed. But the reality is, what's going on inside the electronic box is of no value whatsoever. We've seen that with body armor, where it's been issued to individual infantry soldiers, which has got a wooden plate in it or cardboard in it instead of the ceramic ballistic plates that are in there. The same thing will be happening in their electronics that they're putting onto their vehicles, and they push the troops forward with this false level of confidence. Do you think we could learn the wrong lessons by assuming armored warfare is something that is not going to be part of modern battlefield because of drones, but just because we are not looking at a counter drone, a capable counter drone perspective as part of any armored or vehicle formation that is going forward? And if you got that, that would change the tactics completely.
A lot of unpack there. So, um, I think what's implicit to your question is, can Russia pose a threat even if it doesn't have the ability to do mechanized warfare? And I think the answer to that should be a resounding yes. So, look, I think we're starting to see some bellwethers in national NATO countries now that are starting to sound the alarm about the Russian military threat that it can pose to NATO on a faster timeline. But the conventional wisdom has set for the last 3 years has essentially been the Russians have been greatly degraded in Ukraine. It's going to take Russian industry under best circumstances 3 to 5 years for them to reconstitute their tank fleet and rebuild. Therefore, Russia poses no conventional land warfare threat to Ukraine, or pardon me, to NATO. Therefore, we really don't have to worry about our own security defense for at least 3 to 5 years. And I hope that the conventional wisdom is right. However, I'm concerned, and I think we should consider a assessment and analysis of alternatives, which is okay. However, the predominant mode of fighting in Ukraine, which is large scale combat, high intensity combat operations, is actually not mechanized warfare in the current year. It's actually dismounted infantry. And the Russians have a way of denying the use of mechanized warfare from an adversary with their own drone threat. And the Russians have achieved the effects of battlefield air interdiction without using fixed wing aircraft through the drones. And so, and let's suppose that we get an end of active fighting in Ukraine. Much of that combat power can redeploy within 12 months to the eastern flank. And I actually think that from Russian military can pose a very substantial conventional land threat, using the sorts of tactics and operational concepts that have been honed and used in Ukraine, and crucially do not depend on reconstituting the tank fleet. So I think I, I'm trying to. I think we're trying to argue against complacency in NATO and thinking that, well, the Russians can't take Ukraine. Why could they pose a massive threat to us? And I think that's a little. I'm not quite so confident. Like, I don't know. I don't necessarily use that word, but we need to consider an alternative analysis. The other thing is, so that was, I think that was sort of like one of the implicit questions within the question. Now, the actual question was about maneuver warfare, and can they do it? I think it depends on a lot of factors, right? Clearly, the doctrines are going to change. The tactical situations will become more nuanced. So, it used to be the case that you would not conduct mechanized assaults in muddy and rainy conditions because that would suck. However, those are the best conditions where you actually are going to have the most protection from drones. And it's funny enough, there are Ukrainian non-commissioned officers who have given interviews in Ukrainian language to Ukrainian media who have actually talked about how the best days that they have, the strongest logistics, are the days when it's rainy and cloudy. Uh, because those are the days that the Russians don't interdict their supply trucks and their lorries and things, and that's a sort of inversion of the norm. So it doesn't invalidate the old rules, but it recontextualizes it, and it requires a lot of learning.
Oh, it's amazing. As a former military planner, we always started off with the meteorological reading as to what was going on because Met was with everything. But the other thing that you brought out when you're talking about was this change in the way we understand a front line. And now with drone technology, the close battle isn't what you can see with direct fire from your small arms that your troops have got, or the indirect fire that you got from your mortars or close support artillery. it's what your drones can do, and that close battle is now fought over a 30 kilometer plus up to 50 kilometer deep area. And when you start to put that into perspective, if you're driving that in a vehicle, 50 kilometers, can take you on battlefield conditions an hour to drive. To walk, it can take you a day to walk. That is a huge, huge area to have what we'd consider as a close battle front line now. If you've got pockets of different forces interspersed in different areas. Do you think that's something that we are going to have to sit and wake up to as the new norm if uh, tactics manage to keep heavy armor and heavy vehicles fixed in certain positions?
It's highly dependent on terrain. So what we've actually seen is that the Russians tend to advance more quickly in forested and wooded areas because of the cover and concealment intrinsic to those sorts of terrain. And funnily enough, they seem to be doing slightly better in urban environments because they take advantage of the subterranean tunnel networks. They take advantage of all the hidey spots and hidey holes and buildings. I mean, that's happening in Kupiansk right now, and Kharkiv. And so actually these dismounted infantry can sort of nefariously snake their way through urban environments with same amount of level of attrition. I mean, urban fighting is hard. I'll explain that to you, but much faster because you simply cannot sense and reconnoiter and strike nearly as effectively a urban environment as you can a steppe. And so in eastern Ukraine and southern Ukraine, where we have the steppe, where it's basically just fields and hedgerows and that sort of thing, with large, wide, beautiful, uncontested lines of sight. I mean, that is the terrain that is optimized for the sensor-based drone network, and with all the linked up with the artillery and the mortars and the crude weapons and the drone interceptors, all that stuff. Now, what's interesting, if you think about the Baltic states and the other terrain that are the most vulnerable from a Russian invasion perspective on the eastern flank, you're looking at a lot of forests. You're looking at a lot of terrain that is not really suitable for mechanized warfare in all instances. So it's very canalizing terrain that it directs the troops into narrow kill zones and things like that. But some of those forests are terrible, especially in Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania. And Russian infantry could certainly snake their way and infiltrate through a whole lot of forest. And to reconnoiter with drones would be very, very challenging and difficult. So I think, if the terrain is suitable for the drone application, then yes, you can deny a lot and you can really prevent a tank from moving across a lot of terrain there. If you can find ways to leverage other natural terrain as well. But this is again where I want to try to avoid overgeneralizations. It really depends a lot on the terrain.
It is, but we're also seeing a slight change in Russian tactics, elsewhere when it comes to the use of drones. We've seen reports of drones being launched from their Shadow Fleet shipping to reconnaissance, reconnoiter, German critical national infrastructure, Danish airfields, Swedish military bases, and everything else. Do you think the Russians are sitting back and recognizing what the effect drones are having in the front line, building those lessons up, and looking at your wider integration of combined drone operations as they could potentially use to threaten the West at some stage in the future?
Oh, 100%. Absolutely. I mean, they practiced this in Zapad 2025 exercises with Belarus recently. There's plenty of evidence of cross-theater learning and proliferation of learning from the Ukrainian theater experience. Notably, when Iran conducted its largest ever strike package against Israel in, I believe I forget the year, it was either 2023 or 2024, but there was a very, very large strike package that the Iranians conducted, and it included ballistic missiles and drones. It was modeled after Russian strike packages against Ukraine, designed to overwhelm Western integrated air defense systems. Absolutely. Now, with these Russian acts against NATO member states and the air incursions and the drone reconnoiter events, I think that's exactly right. And I want to be very clear here. These are Russian attacks against individual NATO member states. These are acts of war. And I think that the Eastern states they've been pretty clear, pretty good actually about, I think, using the proper language to describe what's going on. Poland described how in the cyber domain they are at war, and Poland and Romania have described the drone incursions and attributed it to Russia as such. Um, Western European countries, some have been better, some have been worse. They're being sort of coy and beating around the bush about it, but I don't think that's very helpful. And I don't think it's helpful either to describe these attacks as being under the rubric of hybrid warfare or gray zone operators or below the threshold, because what we're looking at here is this. This is an ISW framing. This is phase zero of Russia's offensive or condition setting and preparation for potential future combat operations against NATO member states. It doesn't mean that the Kremlin's made the political decision to do that, but they're setting the conditions that so that they can go when they want to. And this is a collection activity for the Russians. It's also a prodding activity. It's also a learning about NATO institutional weaknesses and finding where the fissures are between the alliance states. And I think they're being quite successful so far, unfortunately.
Well, you described that as a Russian phase zero, but you also described how the Iranians have used the tactics and learned from it. Do you think the Chinese are sitting watching as well and learning these tactics? And this coming together, as we've described it beforehand, as this axis of evil, or the Crink countries, and swapping tactics. If we saw a greater coordination between them from a global perspective, do you think that's something that our Western leaders need to sit up and wake up and suddenly realize that actually looking at a potential threat 3 to 5 to 7 to 10 years out is something that we need to recognize is going to come potentially in 1 to 2 to 3 years?
Yeah, 100%, absolutely. The Chinese are learning from the Russian experience. I mean, they have a tremendous amount of military learning, and look, the Chinese are actually the ones that are enabling the Russian uh, drone capabilities. They're also the ones that are enabling the Ukrainian drone capabilities because the Chinese are the best manufacturing powerhouse on the planet currently. But they're helping the Russians more, and they've taken some subtle steps to try to sabotage the Ukrainians. And the Chinese, due to the nature of their maritime domain dominated theater, are going to have different manifestations of the drones, but they're very interested in the unmanned surface and subsurface naval drones, the likes of which the Ukrainians have employed very successfully. And there are applications for the land-based warfare quadcopter drones as well, but the distance is a little bit different. So it's a little bit different, but absolutely. And yes, we need to be prepared to decisively defeat if we fail in deterring a Russian threat against, no more than 12 months after the end of active fighting in Ukraine, because the Russians are going to be able to reconstitute faster, and they do not need to reconstitute what they have pre-war to pose a significant threat um, against Ukraine and NATO. To that point, I'd also note that just yesterday, on the 13th of October, the Russian government recently passed a new draft amendment to Russia's military service law to actually allow the Russians to be able to send reservists to expeditionary military deployments, which is a major inflection because reservists previously were not eligible to do that, not able to do that under Russian law, unless the Russian government declared a state of war or state of mobilization. That now lowered the threshold for that. And I think this is a canary in the coal mine that indicates that the Russians are going to start changing their fourth generation strategy. They're going to start going after reservists because the previous system where they would recruit volunteers through large financial incentives, I think that's hitting diminishing returns, and they're no longer able to get the numbers they used to, despite increasing the wages higher and higher. So it doesn't mean the system's broken. They're just now going to tap into other resources, and we really, the Russians are quite resilient in that regard.
But it could also be an indication of the fact that to put reservists out into more benign operational theaters, that Russia's in there where they've just got their troops deployed supporting other things. If those can be replaced with reservists, they can bring those more professional troops back and use them on the front line in Ukraine. That will create a little bit of anxiety amongst those troops that are coming in, but could be a clear statement of just the real pain that Russia is suffering from a manpower perspective. Are you getting indications that Russia is properly suffering pain? Because we're up to There's certainly 1.1 million, and if not closer to 1.3 million casualties at the moment.
Yes. So yes, the Russians do have a manpower shortage problem. And I know that sounds ironic given that the Ukrainians also have a manpower shortage problem, but it's also true. And the attrition rates for the Russians are much worse for those than the Ukrainians. And in general, you do need a decisively larger attacker to defender ratio and larger combat operations, as you know. So the equations are a little bit different here. But yes, that's true. We have noticed over the last year how the Russian strategy for recruits has been hitting diminishing returns. For example, the Russians have a federal budget for recruiting for the entire fiscal year 2025. They blew through their entire year-long budget in the first quarter of 2025, and they generated about 90,000 recruits out of that. There's many federal subjects, Russian oblasts and krais and that sort of thing, that have blown through their federal budgets as well, or rather their regional level budgets, but it's all Russia's rentier state, all comes from the federal government. They've blown through their budgets as well to recruit these people. And then there was a Russian language RFERL investigation that was published just the other day that also found that these Russian federal subjects, despite pumping up the wages, which usually sort of demand and supply curve would pump up the number of volunteers, that started to no longer work. And so, you know, it doesn't mean Russia has no more people. They have more people, but it just means they're going to have to move away from this voluntary system into a compulsory system where they go after reservists. And here's where the Russians will play an information operation game, because the Russians are going to invest a lot of effort in framing this as voluntary service, because to become a reservist, you have to volunteer to be a reservist. You get paid. You get paid monthly to be a reservist. You had to sign a contract to become a reservist. It's not. There's nothing compulsory about becoming a reservist. But once you've taken the trap and signed up to be a reservist, now they're changing the thresholds that the reservists can be sent. And the Russians are going to frame this as, well, you volunteered for the war when you volunteered to become a reservist, and that's really not quite true. And so, insofar as I think that there's an effort here to try to exploit and shine a light on how Putin is starting to have to violate elements of his social contract with Russians, this is going to be a big part of it.
Yeah. Do you think that the Ukrainian tactic of attacking the Russian oil infrastructure, and the way that that's translating into the Russian people in a number of different regions suffering shortages of petrol, diesel, and therefore affecting their day to day life, is having an impact on the Russian people's thoughts as to how the government can keep them protected, and therefore that's having a secondary impact on ability to recruit and support for the operation or anything else? Or do you think the Russian people are becoming a bit like the Ukrainians and slightly more focused on protecting the homeland, and therefore it is increasing their resolve?
I think it's neither. I think the Russians are most Russian citizens are fairly apathetic, and when there's less petrol available at their local gas station, that's just an annoyance and a bother, and that they might blame on the local governor or something. But it's not going to increase the propensity for relatively wealthy people. I mean, if you own a car in Russia and you're going to buy gas, you're already sort of categorically not part of that very poor class that were the ones that were most susceptible to the financial incentive to join. So there's a sort of that selection bias and implicit in the question there. And then most Russians, I think, are actually quite fine and apathetic about the state of the war, what's going on. It's I think the effect is most important for how it affects Russian Federation's bottom line with their revenues. Um, but I don't think it actually does a whole lot in terms of hearts and minds. I think the Russians will continue to fight as long as the Russian state calls them to do so.
Hmm. So effectively, what we're saying is that it's still stalemate on the front line, and there's no real move forward. We've got Zelensky meeting Trump in Washington on Friday. What should we be telling POTUS that he should be doing to support President Zelensky in trying to change and move away from this? This status quo that the conflict has sort of become, where it is almost culminated for both sides. What does he need to do to help move things on?
So we need to start thinking about how to rebuild Ukraine's mid-range operational range strikes capability. I think we talked about that the last time that we spoke. So that's very important, and there's things that we can do to do that. But look, we're currently in a big policy debate about do we send Ukraine Tomahawks, and I would argue that we should send Ukraine Tomahawks, even if it's a small number. I know that the United States doesn't have a large number of Tomahawks to give, but I would argue that a small number, even a small number of tomahawks, if used intelligently and effectively, could have a very important effect on the war. For example, the Russians have a factory that produces Shahed Iranian drones for the one-way attack drones. It's in Tartarstan, and if you look at that factory, you probably don't. You'll need a larger than 10 number of tomahawks, but a smaller than 50 number of tomahawks to severely damage that facility. And I think taking that facility offline would be quite good because it has the production capacity to make 2,700 drones a month. That Russians launch every few days, 500 plus of these drones at Ukraine, not just for the strategic long-range bombing campaign, but also increasingly for frontline strikes. We'll see occasionally heads used to strike frontline or middle-range operational range targets too. That's a huge capability that's scaled up, and we forget that Russia is actually dependent on external supporters and backers. They're dependent on a shadow fleet that the Russians don't own. They're dependent on Iranian drone capabilities. They're dependent on artillery provided by North Korea. And if we can start to erode some of these support buttresses that come internationally to Russia, that can actually, I think, impose sufficient problems on Putin that will cause him to go to the negotiating table. And crucially, POTUS is in the right mindset to accept this sort of argument right now, because as we know, he has just through brute force discovered that the Russians are not willing to negotiate, and he has enabled the U.S. intelligence community to help make these Ukrainian strikes against the Russian oil infrastructure and the gas infrastructure that much more effective. So the president understands to get the Russians to the table, you have to degrade them.
Yeah. Well, that's good for US business as well. And the Tomahawks, alongside the Ukrainian domestic flamingos, are just giving another golf club in the golf bag of different capabilities that are needed out there. But, George, this gives us lots more to talk about because, by the sound of things, this conflict isn't going anywhere soon. Thank you very much indeed for talking to me again on Times Radio Frontline.
Of course. Yeah. Thanks for having me. Always a pleasure. And I'm sure we'll have lots more to discuss.
You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like access to exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership and watch us on YouTube. But you can now get us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. And don't forget, you can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs and read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.